I'm going to present this paper I wrote with Matteo Gatti and Matteo Tonello. This is basically a chapter of a collection edited by Luca Enriquez and me, and also Tim and Jennifer contributed to the chapter, also other colleagues that are in this room. I want to thank them for this. And this chapter basically aims to shed light on how board shareholder engagement works. This is something quite difficult because simply because as Tim mentioned just now, board shareholder engagement takes place behind the scenes. So because of this, there are not data available basically. And to overcome the limited availability of data, there are two different strategies. The first one is to obtain proprietary data from just one investors. There are some studies relying on this approach, but of course, if you have data only from one investor, it's quite difficult to draw general conclusion about shareholder engagement, especially if this investor is quite small. The alternative approach is to distribute a survey among investors, and probably the leading corporate finance paper on this topic, the one by McCary, Starks, and Sotner is based on a survey. So, and then we try to replicate this approach. And thanks to the conference board, that is basically the lobby, I would say, of independent directors in the US, we distributed a survey among SEC registered business corporation. We conducted the survey in the spring 2022, more or less 1 year ago. We circulated the survey among, I would say, 1,000 officers, legal counsel, and so on. And we received 171 responses that, according to the guys, the conference board is a good rate of response. And the survey, basically, we asked to provide some information on how engagement works based on the engagement conducted in 2022 and in the year before, so in the 12 preceding months. And we included around 30, 35 questions, but basically the main topics were the topic and outcome of engagement, the types of investors the company engage with, and the frequency of engagement, and whether the engagement is confrontational. And we also try to complement this survey with data and with other sources of data, and we use a review of disclosure data on corporate shareholder engagement from companies included in the Russell 3000 index and the S&P 500. And maybe here it was mentioning that around 83% of S&P 500 companies provide disclosure on engagement, while only 45% of Russell 3000 companies provide such disclosure. This means that larger corporations pay greater attention to board shareholder engagement and to the disclosure concerning the board shareholder engagement. And we also relied on the proxy system of the proxy voting trends, that is a collection of data provided by the conference board at Rutgers University. So this is the methodology. Turning to the major findings of the paper. So the first point is the frequency, of course, and if you look at the part in the red circle, you can see that usually investors tend to engage more with larger corporations. Basically, in this case, larger corporations mean S&P 500 companies, corporations. And but if you look at the last line, you can see that around 40% of Russell 3000 companies have never engaged with investors. So this is this confirms that larger companies are the preferred targets for board shareholder engagement. Well, we also look at the trend in board shareholder engagement, and around 80% of respondents confirmed that they saw an increase in engagement over the last 2 years. But what is maybe interesting is that this increase is more pronounced with respect to the executive compensation issues and also to the environmental policy issues. Also, I think that it's quite relevant to note that there is not such an increase with respect to the social issues. So maybe when we talk about T, S, and G, the E is a little bit more relevant than the S according to this evidence. Another key issue in our view is the typology of engaged shareholders. And as you can see, the asset managers, so we can say the mainstream institutional investors like the famous big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, and the Street are the main interlocutors of companies. They are followed by hedge funds, but as Jennifer and Tim mentioned before, there are also other institutions that try to engage with companies. For example, we have church or religious group that is probably someone we do not expect to find in these results. But another interesting note maybe is that retail investors are not so relevant in this engagement, in this kind of exchange with the companies. Retail investors engage in a very limited number of cases, and perhaps surprising, they tend to engage with larger companies. Well, another aspect that can be relevant is the weight of the engaged shareholders. And we look at the aggregated shares held by shareholders who engage in one or more occasions. I would like to highlight this in one or more occasions because the percentages you see do not relate to each single engagement, but all relate to the all engagement occur in the fiscal year. And it is relevant to see that at least 30% of the whole sample engage with shareholders representing more than half that the outstanding shares. That's quite relevant. If you look at the data overall, basically around 80% of companies usually engage with shareholders representing more than 30% of outstanding shares. So it's quite relevant data. Well, the nature of the engagement. So we asked whether the engagement is confrontational, and basically where only about 4 out of 10 engagement in confrontational. So very frequently the engagement is confrontational, and roughly 60% of the companies included in the survey experienced confrontational engagement. So this is perhaps a little bit surprising because engagement usually is considered to be very different from activism, but at the end of the day, also engagement can be confrontation, at least from the point of view of engaged companies. Well, we have also a long part on topics, but I would like to make it very short. And basically, the most frequent topics of engagement are executive compensation. It is not surprising, but also climate, greenhouse gas emission, and world diversity. And I would like also to highlight that corporate purpose seems to be not issue because only 14% of corporation reported engagement dealing with corporate purpose. Well, the outcome of shareholder engagement, this is, I think, is an important part of our study. In general terms, it seems that engagement is quite consequential. As you can see, around 45% of surveyed companies reported that engagement led to a change in a corporate practice that is quite significant, and more than 50% of surveyed companies disclosed reported that engagement led to additional disclosure. And what is interesting also the link between voting and engagement, because around, if I remember correctly, 40% of surveyed companies reported that shareholders withdrew their resolution after the engagement. So this is something that also have to understand the dynamics of shareholder resolutions. Well, this is a very brief illustration of the findings of the paper, some conclusion, or maybe I would say some final remarks. So the first one is larger companies tend to be engaged more frequently. This is probably a consequence also of the rise in the passive investing, because of course larger companies has a greater weight in the portfolio. This is maybe a financial incentive to engage more with larger companies, but maybe engaging with larger companies also comes with some reputational benefits or some marketing effect, because of course this is something that go in the news. So if you engage with British Petroleum or Total or other oil companies. And what is also interesting that according to our results, larger companies are more likely to initiate engagement. So in this case, maybe larger companies, because are the preferred target of institutional investors, maybe can be willing to anticipate some confrontational engagement and to start the engagement by themselves. There is also another evidence, I didn't explain this in detail, but we have evidence that the survey also showed that smaller companies are increasingly engaged, but at the same time, we also saw that engagement with smaller companies tend to be shorter and less repetitive, and often relates to ESG issues. And that's maybe something in our view that is quite in line with the so-called systematic stewardship approach as defined by Gordon, Coffey, and Condon. The very last point is about what we call the fine line between activism and engagement, because according to the survey, hedge funds are major engagers. As I said before, more than 60% of respondents reported engagement with hedge funds. And maybe it can be that engagement is just a part, maybe the initial stage of an activism initiatives. And this is something that can have also, in our view, an impact on some corporate finance papers, because I am finished. Because maybe there are some empirical papers that rely on 13D disclosure to track activism, activist intervention. And maybe this approach undercounts intervention that are not made public because just takes place behind the scenes. And at the same time, when a study uses the so-called matching technique, where the companies affected by activism are compared with companies not affected by activism, activist intervention, maybe the control group can include companies that were affected by activists, but in the form of engagement. So they didn't make this public. So this evidence maybe can have some implication also from empirical studies, at least from our point of view, this is something that may be taken into account. Thank you very much.